Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I'm happy to be here with my fellow author, Trena Paulus. As you can see, we both have books that have very similar titles. We see these as complementary texts, almost companion books, but that doesn't mean that they are the same. So today we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the key ideas in each of our books. Trena, anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity. I was so excited to see your new edition come out recently. And yeah, there's a lot of really great material in both books. So I'm glad we'll have a chance to kind of highlight to potential readers how they might look at these books as a set.
I think many researchers today are realizing that the technologies they use in their everyday lives, their professional and academic lives, are also technologies that they might decide to use for research. But the process of thinking through that, really, takes some consideration. And both of us have kind of different ways of helping people to think about that transition. In mine, I have created this framework, and I am presenting it as a circle because I think that not only is it important to take a holistic view, and certainly, many of the things that we'll talk about are similar, whether the study is going to be done face to face, online, or in a hybrid capacity. But when you start to talk about using technology, there are implications for all of the different areas of design. So it's not only holistic, it's also iterative. You may make some design decisions and then, realize that you need to refine your thinking a little bit because the technology choices will call you to do something differently. For example, if you're thinking about using a tool like the video conferencing space we are in now, well, then, do your potential participants have video cameras? Do they have broadband? How does that choice relate to the kinds of data that you want to collect? So every decision that you make has repercussions throughout the design. So I present it as a circle and have chapters that relate to each one of these. And you also have uh, a way of kind of spelling out the different stages as a kind of whole set
Yeah,
of
yeah,
thinking.
yeah, absolutely. And I love that you call it the research, your e-research framework, because I think, thinking of it as an overarching part of the design and that it's not just to add in features here and there, tools and spaces, but to think about how it's an integrated workflow. In this edition, while in the first edition we did talk about digital tools across the research process, we really were foregrounding what we called methodological considerations, which does have
Mm-hmm.
some nice overlap with your e-research framework, where we help the reader walk through these 9 considerations and think really specifically about how the tools and spaces can be used. Like, for example, consideration 5, if you know that you want to conduct interviews as a type of qualitative data, then what are some of the methodological decisions that you have to make
Mm-hmm.
before you even jump to, well, we're going to do it on Zoom, or we're going to do it on email, we're going to do it
Right.
on, instant messaging. So yeah, we also kind of tried to frame that, and then think about digital workflows and how to help the reader make those decisions.
I think that by presenting the research design in this way, that the ways that we both have done this, it lets the researcher understand that, that even though, say, maybe you're thinking, well, I'm going to collect my data online, or I'm going to use a particular tool at this particular stage. Well, it also affects the other stages of the process too.
Yes,
So
yes,
just thinking through, the whole thing, not just oh, I'm going to plop, this piece in, at this
right,
particular stage. So,
absolutely.
So another kind of area that we've both given some thought to is about what kinds of research you can do online, what lends itself to online research for a qualitative study. So the way that I've broken this down is to think about kind of three types, three broad types. So the first would be what I call extant, using extant data. And so these are materials that are using any kind of materials that were developed without our influence. The people who developed these did not care what we were studying. We have no contact with them. We're just using it as data. So this could include, any number of kinds of sources. And the main issue here is that, we are not having any direct contact with the people who generated that data. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that consent is not needed. Sometimes we do need consent or permission to use those kinds of private materials. And that's, of course, a complex decision-making, is involved with that. Then the next kind of category is what I call elicited. So here is where we're asking questions or prompting participants, consenting participants, in a variety of ways. So interviews, questionnaires, participant observation, where we're asking someone, hey, tell me about what you're doing there. Anything that where we're asking questions in whatever form, visual or verbal or written, I would categorize as elicited. But when I was working on this and after kind of looking at what kinds of research is emerging, I realized that we needed another category. And so I call this enacted. Some might call it performative. Here, it's not just asking questions. We're moving to another level where, we might be creating a situation that allows the participants to respond or become engaged. Here, you can see that this is going to require, a deeper level of collaboration, probably more than one interaction with the participants. We're not simply just meeting for an interview and we're done. We are, we're going to be engaged in some kind of process. So within this, we might include arts-based creative methods, experiments, simulations, and things like that.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us how do you kind of break down the different types?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. So with the, actually, I don't think there's a slide on that one.
Okay.
I think I can talk about it in relation to this great table here. So with extant data, we've called that pre-existing or naturally occurring data, again, to capture that idea that it would be there whether the researcher was or not. We also kind of talk about it as digital spaces because it's usually in the digital space where you find extant data. And then we just contrast that with researcher generated data that we collect with digital tools. But we did not make that distinction between elicited and enacted, but I think it's really useful, especially because, and I don't know whether we mentioned this in the book, I think we did, but, I've tried to make the argument that all research should move towards being enacted, because if you're working with your participants instead of studying them or doing research on them, they're much more likely to actually do something with those findings. And so I think as researchers, and this may be, also an ethical consideration kind of on a more macro level, is that the more we can generate data alongside our participants in collaboration, and I love that you've got participatory action research there, I think the more useful and practical it may actually be, instead of, just doing research because it answers a question that you as the researcher has. So we don't necessarily make that distinction. But we really look at digital tools and digital spaces, researcher generated, or naturally occurring. But either way, I think both of these ways of categorizing should help you as a researcher think through which is going to help you answer your research question in the most
And
meaningful
it,
way.
it certainly may be that you decide you are going to have a combination of these
Yes.
approaches. So
Yes.
you might have a lot of extant data is available that explains, informs understanding of your research problem, but you're
Hmm.
still going to then have some questions of like, well, why?
Yeah.
Why did that, or what was going on here that, where you want to ask someone some questions, about that, to make sense of what you've gotten from that extant data and, move into um, posing some questions, as in a questionnaire or an interview. Or it may be that, you want to move into that kind of collaborative, generative, style of enacted research. But, you need to start somewhere. So maybe
Hmm.
you begin by having some, an email exchange with the participants, or some, kind of more informal um, conversation, to allow you to, build up the credibility and trust and explain what you're doing with the study and,
Yeah.
get them involved. So, I think, it's not necessarily that there's a hard and fast line, but the
Mhm.
clearer we can be, the better off we are, because whatever kind of study you're planning to do, you're probably going to need to explain it to someone, whether it's your dissertation committee, to participants, to gatekeepers who are going to decide whether you can have access to an archive. So, being able to clearly define what you're doing and describe it is something that I think both of our books, really try to help you to do. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that I think, is interesting resonance between our books is, thinking about that, what you call the naturally occurring, extant data. And, I break this down because I think, there are, tons of historical materials. And while we sometimes wish that history did not repeat itself, it does. So even if we're studying something that's really of the moment, there may be some historical background that is going to give us important context. And, more and more materials are becoming available of all kinds, not only documents, but visual materials and films and all sorts of things that are available in archives. So we
Yeah.
have those historical materials that are, say, pre-digital age. And then once the digital age started, well, there's an electronic copy somewhere of whatever it was. So, there are all kinds of records and that might be available in a digital form that you can access.
Mhm.
Those may be in the public, on the public web, or they may be in organizations' archives, or even persons' individual, hard drive. So, the fact that they are electronic doesn't necessarily mean that, they're waiting for you to download them, for your study, but, they are, they're out there. And then what I call emergent materials, where it's like, these are the tweets that have been made since we've been here talking, the
Mhm.
things that are happening right now, and that, may or may not be, persistent, in an archive somewhere, but, are, kind of the living dialogue that's occurring all the time on the web. And I know, with this book and your book about analyzing online talk,
Yeah.
you delve quite a bit into those forms.
Yes. Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that it's not just those forms that are available online. I think people go straight to social media and
Mhm.
online conversations when actually, yeah, the archival material, the historical materials, documents that are on. I mean, so much of the way we create institutions these days are by posting a lot of stuff online, and that's how we generate the whole electronic version of an
Mhm.
institution. And yeah, all of those have so much relevance for understanding the social world, like we're trying to do as qualitative researchers.
So, of course, both of our books have to do with technology and the use of
Yes.
different kinds of technology. So let's just shift a moment and talk a little bit about kind of the thinking behind that. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
that and how that's evolved with this new edition?
Yeah, I mean, this was a huge shift for us. So after we wrote the first book, we encountered a critique of our book from Catherine Adams and Terry Lynn Thompson. They wrote a book called Researching a Post-Human World, Interviews with Digital Objects. And they really critiqued our first book for not engaging enough in the theory behind technology choices and not encouraging researchers to engage with technology choices in meaningful, reflexive ways. So we really took some of their recommendations and we took that critique to heart. And one thing we thought a lot about was this idea of the fact that a lot of, especially in American culture, we tend to look at technology very optimistically, that if we use technology, it's going to solve all our problems. And we don't always think about the unintended consequences. And we also have a very almost passive role as humans because we often, in American culture anyway, we look at technology as deterministic, that and you'll see a lot of this around qualitative data analysis software in the literature, is that people assume if you use the software, it's going to force you to do something to your data that you don't want to. And I think that, we really were trying to shift from an overly optimistic or an overly deterministic view of technology from a theoretical stance to instead using and drawing on some of the new materialism ideas that Adams and Thompson talk about in their book, to really frame it as it's a dynamic interplay between the humans, the methods, and the materials, which is the tools and the spaces, that they're all intersecting, they're all influencing each other, and it's complicated, it's complex. It's not that you should always use a technology or never use it. It's the kind of solution is somewhere in the middle. And so that really helped us complexify, I think, the way that we talk about those choices and try to help researchers think through those choices. How about you?
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about these questions before I?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yes. So those are actually just examples of those questions that we actually close each chapter of the book out with a version of these questions depending on the topic. So how do these tools impact your methods? How do they impact the tools themselves? Because sometimes a tool, the way it is now, cannot accomplish the method. And we have to talk back to the tools and say, hey, Zoom, we really want to be able to do this. Can you help us? And then sometimes Zoom will add new features, right? How does it change us? Going on to Zoom to collect data is not always a good thing. So, and that's where the ethics and the political consequences come in. And then also thinking about quality, the impact on the outcomes, like, are you going to be able to do a rigorous, valid study using those tools? So yeah, those are the ways that we're still thinking through this kind of framework, but we're playing around with it. It's how we kind of closed each chapter. And now we're kind of working on next steps and trying to provide guidance in how people do this.
Right, and it gives people some ways to critique approaches they may be considering, to think through what the different dimensions are. So, I think that this, the impact on humans might be something that people are accustomed to thinking about, but not on the sort of materiality and that. So, one of the ways that I encourage people to think about it is, what is the kind of role that technology plays in the study? And I'm using the acronym ICTs to for information and communication technologies, because it could be that it's an app or something not necessarily just using a computer online. So the wide range of technologies. So in the first example, as a medium, it's simply, the person is not in the same place where you are, and you need to communicate with them. So you're using the technology simply as a communications medium, either to access participants, or to access extant data as we were just describing. But here, if I'm using this with participants, the topic of the study, the problem we're talking about may have absolutely nothing to do with technology. We are simply using this tool as a medium. But then at the next level, well, there are some particular features that I want in this conversation. Do I want to be able to see the other person? Do I want to be able to share visuals? Are there characteristics of the platform that are important to me? And another way of thinking about the setting is, is there a place online where the people I'm interested in talking with congregate? Is there a type of virtual community or an online space where people with this interest can be found to either recruit as participants or to observe, etc. So here, when I'm making this choice about the setting, well, this is going to have implications for my participants, because if I've decided I want to be able to see them, well, then, I need to communicate in my recruitment materials that, you need to be able to use these certain kinds of tools or have access to them, etc. So, it's going to have, I'm adding some more criteria here. It's more than just a medium. There's something about this technology that itself will be important to the study. But then in the third category, here, we're taking a different slant, because now the technology itself is part of what I'm looking at.
Wow.
So, I'm not, let's use an example. Let's say I'm interested in how parents have gone through the COVID pandemic with their children. In the medium, I'm just using this, to talk with them. In the setting, maybe I'm looking for an online community where parents are, trading ideas and strategies and that sort of thing. Or maybe I choose a platform like we're in now because I want to have, 3 or 4 parents in a group discussion. I want to be able to see them to see each other, and to be able to share screenshots of, different kinds of examples and things like that. So I've chosen that as a setting, but still I'm not studying the technology tool, I'm studying the people. But here as a phenomenon, I'm studying the tool. I want to know what kinds of things are parents sharing? How are they using are they sharing books that they're reading with their kids? Are they sharing, activities you can do with a toddler? What are they sharing, on a particular kind of platform? How does that vary, given the technology they've studied? So, when you look at the literature and you see things they call, like, say, internet studies, well, there are researchers who are interested in the technology. And so again, it's not a matter of either or. It could be that you're using the technology tool as a medium for communication, and it's a phenomenon you're studying, or, it could be a combination. But again, the clearer you can be, the better you can make those other design decisions.
Yeah.
Another related decision would be, if I'm using the technology tool simply as a medium, it may be that I'm emailing participant A and I'm meeting with participant B in a chat room, in a chat tool, and I'm having a video conference with somebody else. It doesn't matter, because it's simply the medium. Whereas if I'm making some of these other design choices, then I have to decide, well, how important is it that I have a consistent approach across these different participants?
Yeah, and I like that. It's funny because ICTS phenomenon might be something you end up studying as part of your reflexivity, like how well did
Hmm.
it work for the purpose of this
Right.
study, even though you're not really studying,
Hmm.
the phenomenon per se, you may end up taking a look at that in the context of, well, did it work? Did it not work? Is it good for this particular purpose? But yeah, those three really fit well together and really do need to be considered.
And I think that that phenomenon aspect relates somewhat to the materiality,
Yes.
because here I might say, well, how effective is this tool? As a research, um, how effective this is as a research platform. What are the
Yeah.
limitations? For example, can I protect the data?
Yes.
Can I, those kinds of decisions. So, uh,
Hmm.
I encourage people, and I think this fits with both of
Mm.
our lines of thinking,
Hmm.
rather than, while, there may be technologies you're accustomed to using in your everyday life that you're thinking, oh, I'll use that in my study. You step back and think, what is the form of communication you want to have? What are the characteristics of that setting or of that medium that you need to carry out the study, and then look at the platform that will fit your need rather than the other way around. So, and I tend to not even mention brand
Yeah.
names uh, to the extent possible, because for one thing, they are not paying me to advertise for them, and they're making plenty of money without my help. But also, different tools are used in different parts of the world. So, if you're planning to engage with participants in other places, or you're planning to access data, in different parts of the world, there may be tools that are more familiar to people that will meet your needs.
And they come and go so quickly. The most
Right.
popular tool right now won't be here in 6 months. So yeah, for sure. Features, not brand names, is key.
So, of course, through all of these decisions, ethical questions come up, and it's probably, the most challenging area for many people. And both of our books delve into that. So, why don't you start and talk a little bit about these basic principles that you've outlined here?
Yeah, so when we think about pre-existing, naturally occurring, or extant data, however, we want to frame that, this is the question that I get asked the most by far as a researcher, is around the ethics of looking at what now people call social media data, but of course it was not called that back when I
Mhm.
started working with it in 1990s. It was online discussion forums or online conversations, but when we think about the impact on people when we're making research design decisions, and not just on us as researchers, but on our participants,
Mhm.
this is just kind of a shorthand list of things to consider when you might want to work with social media data. And this is all articulated much more comprehensively in the book that we put out, I guess, in 2019, on the topic of how do you do research design around looking at online talk. But first, you just don't want to harm people. And that's everything from by accidentally revealing their identities to bringing too much attention to a particular online community that you're studying without the people knowing that you're doing that. So you really want to
Mhm.
think through, what's the worst case scenario if I do this study? And here I'm talking about maybe often studies where informed consent is not necessarily needed or even possible because people are not talking as themselves online. They may be fully anonymous or using a pseudonym. I'm thinking about, for example, like Reddit. Most people don't tend to be themselves on Reddit. So if the topic of the conversation is not that sensitive, for example, I've looked at discussion forums of people talking about long distance hiking and what equipment they
Mhm.
want to use to hike the Appalachian Trail. I don't consider that sensitive. But I've also looked at discussion forums of people with HIV/AIDS diagnosis talking about possible treatment plans, and that's definitely more sensitive. And so that's going to
Mhm.
impact how you make design decisions around ethics and consent. How vulnerable are the authors? Obviously, long distance hikers are, I mean, well, not obviously, but you would, if you compare long distance hikers with people with HIV/AIDS, there's a difference there in how vulnerable their words might be. Do the people themselves expect it to be private? If it's a fully open discussion forum where you don't need to log in, people aren't themselves, they're posting under assumed identity. If it says very clearly on the website, be careful what you post here, anybody can see it. There's not as much of an expectation of privacy as if you're looking at your Facebook friends and you decide you're going to look at their posts as data. That's probably not as okay because they expect it to be private. If their Facebook posts are limited only to their friends, then you can't look at that as a researcher in a very ethical way without their permission. Who is their intended audience? Is it you as a researcher, or is it just a small group of friends? And then you have to act accordingly. And then, if you decide you need to get or should get informed consent, is it even possible to do that? And then how would you go about that? And then can you protect their identities? Keeping in mind that it's not just their real world identity, but their pseudonym identity that you need to protect, because people often have a reputation alongside that pseudonym that they've chosen. And so you can't just, dismiss the need to protect identity. So those are some of the key, not everything, but some of the things that I try to talk through with people. Like I said, because this is what I get asked about the most is, oh, I just found this Reddit form. I don't need to get IRB approval, right? And it's like, well, well, maybe you have to think through it a little bit more. So yeah.
Right. So as I kind of laid out in this mind map,
it's a winding road.
It's a winding road. And, there are many dimensions to think through in terms of ethics with online research. And, some of the things that you've mentioned about, whether, do the people consider it as a public or a private space? And that, goes for, not only collecting the extant naturally occurring, user generated data, but also archives, that sort of thing, but also technology tools that you might think about in terms of communicating with consenting participants. So, if you've got, you're using a platform, going back to those technology choices and the materiality, does it have, the allow you the ability to protect any data that you've collected on it or not? And, how do you make those kind of decisions? Lots of things to think about. So, one of the I tend to use a lot of continua in my writings because it just seems like, they're, the questions are not yes, no, black and white.
Right.
And, so, one of the big issues is, of course, around informed consent. And, it's been interesting with this diagram. This is something that has changed, over time. And, as I have consulted with other, experts in the field, I would say that this, the informed consent and or permissions needed has become a bigger part of this diagram, that, people using social media, or, other kinds of data where, initially people were thinking like, it's out there.
Yes.
People put it out there, it's good to go. That view, I think, is
it's changed
shifting,
a lot. I agree
quite a bit. And that, a lot of the things that anyone watching this who is, not been thinking about this in a research context, but think about it just in terms of your own personal life. How many articles do you see on an almost daily basis to do with protecting your privacy, protecting your data? There's much more concern about that. So, as researchers, we need to be kind of up to date with some of those things and be clear about them. So, I tried to lay this out. There are some things that are fairly obvious if we are doing what I would the elicited or enacted, interacting with human participants. Well, that's it's fairly obvious that I'm going to need consent. But, I encourage people to think about consent, not, as this, horrible kind of thing that you have to
To
just
avoid at all costs, right?
get through, but to think about that it is your friend. As a qualitative researcher, this allows you, in the discussion that you are having around the consent agreement, it's not only consent, it's the informed. And that the
Yeah.
more informed someone is about what it is you're trying to do, why it's important, what they are contributing to building some new understandings, it will, allow you to collect and generate, more meaningful data, particularly if you are, studying something that is more sensitive, more personal, more private. So, using your description there. So, I hope that this is helpful to people, but I think, both of us in our books in different ways of kind of, really saying to our readers, there are some guidelines available that you can consult about online research. There are published articles you can look at, to see examples and decide whether they're good examples or not. But you're going to need to develop, what the ethics researchers called phronesis of the practical wisdom and the judgment to decide, what is really going to be best throughout all the stages of the study. As you mentioned in what some of your comments about, it's not only about the data, collecting the data, it's also, well, who's going to view the data while we're in the analysis process? Is it going to be
Yeah.
just the researcher? I'm looking at these pictures, or my research team, my supervisor, my committee, who
Yep.
will see it while it's in process? How can I protect it while the study is underway? And then how am I going to present this data, presentations, in articles, in publications, throughout all of that? There's constantly going to be, the questioning about how you go about things, and it may be, looking at these just very kind of distilled summaries of some of these perspectives. But, in some situations, you might say, well, there are guidelines and there are rules that, my institution will be fine with me doing, taking this approach, but I'm not, because
Yeah.
I don't feel that it's right.
Yep.
So I'm going to, to use those, ethics of care, to be
Hmm.
sure I'm going to take the extra mile of protecting this, uh, the data and these individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think, we have some, lots of resources in both of these books that, should help anyone who is a qualitative researcher thinking about, either, having a research design idea that you want to figure out how to accomplish, or if you're just at the very beginning, try to say, well, what could I even do with, how could I conduct a study online? Where do I start? That with both books, we try to provide the methodological, theoretical, ethical foundations, and then, the practical, well, how are you going to do it? So I hope that
Yes.
viewers will take a look at these books and see what might be useful.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I'll also just mention another thing that I think is helpful in both books is that the use of researcher cameos in your book, which is
Mm,
real world examples of studies and kind of tracing
mhm,
those throughout the whole process. And we also have vignettes from researchers who describe how they use the
mhm.
tools and spaces in different ways across the process. So I think we both do a great job of having real practical examples from real world studies that can kind of help give people an idea of what it might look like if they're, so even if
Mhm.
the reader's not sure if they want to use or how the digital, the
Mhm.
virtual, I think those examples really help.
Right, and help to then also refine. You might, have an idea to begin with, but there are so many choices to make, that by looking at some of these examples and the different ways that we've offered them, that could help you say, well, that's kind of similar to what I would like to do, and then to kind of take it through, what the different kinds of key questions might be that you would need to ask yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Well, thanks, Trina. It's really interesting to look at our books side by side and just a few of the characteristics that we've shared here today. And I hope that anyone viewing this will find it helpful as they take a closer look at our books.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it a lot. Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun to take a closer look together and talk about that.
Okay.